The Earth will end in 3 days.
We can't do anything. The Earth will be destroyed. We can't help you. You've been destroying the land all year. You're to blame for this.
The fluorescent lights in corridor 3B never turned off. I learned that my first week at the Pentagon in 1973, when I was 26 years old and still believed that intelligence analysis meant studying Soviet submarine deployments and satellite photographs of missile silos. My name is Dr. Robert Chen. I spent 50 years inside the most classified programs the United States government ever conceived. I held clearances with designations that still don't officially exist. I analyzed materials that violated every known law of physics. And on August 14th, 1974, in a windowless room 60 feet below the Pentagon's basement level, I spoke with something that wasn't human. I'm 77 now, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe 8. The secrecy agreements I signed don't expire when I die. They're binding on my estate, my family, anyone who might inherit my papers. But I've decided that some truths are more important than oaths sworn to men who are themselves long dead. This isn't a confession. It's a testimony. It began on a Tuesday morning in August. I was working in signals intelligence, analyzing radio intercepts from Warsaw Pact communications. My security clearance was top secret with SCI access. High, but not unusual for my position. I was good at my job. I spoke Mandarin, Russian, and passable Vietnamese. I had a doctorate in linguistics from MIT. I was exactly the kind of analyst who disappeared into the machine and stayed there for 30 years. That morning, a Marine corporal I'd never seen before appeared at my desk. He didn't salute. He didn't speak. He simply handed me a manila folder marked with a classification I didn't recognize, Umbra Cosmic Majestic. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words. Report to room J227 immediately. I asked the corporal what this was about. He looked at me with the kind of blank expression you only see in people who've been trained not to think about what they know. Sir, I'm instructed to escort you. That's all I can say. The walk took 11 minutes. We descended 3 levels below the basement. The corporal used a key I'd never seen, octagonal, made of some metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The door to J227 was steel, 18 inches thick. It opened without sound. Inside, 3 men in civilian clothes waited, and behind them, mounted in what looked like a medical isolation chamber, was a window into another room. Through that window, I saw it for the first time. The thing in the chamber wasn't moving. At first, I thought it might be a mannequin, some kind of training exercise for psychological operations. The figure stood approximately 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to have one too many joints. Its skin, if you could call it that, had the color and texture of wet clay, slightly translucent with darker structures visible beneath like shadows under ice. But it was the head that made my hands shake. Too large, too smooth. Eyes that wrapped around the sides of the skull, black and reflective as volcanic glass. No nose, just subtle slits. A mouth that seemed less like an opening and more like a seam in reality itself. Dr. Chen. The voice belonged to the oldest of the 3 men. His ID badge said, Dr. Vaughn, but no agency affiliation. You've been selected for Project Looking Glass. What you're about to hear is classified at a level that supersedes presidential authority. You will never speak of this to anyone outside this program. You will never write about it. You will never encrypt it, code it, or allude to it in any form. Do you understand? I nodded. My mouth was too dry to speak. Good. We need a linguist. The entity in that chamber has been in our custody since 1947. It survived the Roswell incident. For 27 years, it has refused to communicate using any method we understand. Last week, it began producing sounds. We think it's trying to speak. We need you to find the pattern. Dr. Vaughn handed me a folder 3 inches thick. Inside were spectrograms, phonetic transcriptions, frequency analyses. Dozens of researchers had tried and failed. The sounds the entity produced didn't correspond to any human language family. They didn't even correspond to how human vocal anatomy could function. What does it want? I asked. That's what you're going to tell us. The first week, I listened to recordings. Hours and hours of sounds that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my chest cavity. I mapped frequencies. I looked for repetition, for structure, for anything resembling grammar or syntax. Nothing. The sounds were beautiful in a way that made me nauseous, like music played backward or equations spoken aloud. My wife asked me why I came home every night with headaches. I told her it was stress from the Soviet desk. She knew I was lying. After 15 years of marriage, she could always tell. By the second week, I was allowed into the observation room, closer. The entity stood motionless for hours, then would move with sudden liquid grace that seemed to violate inertia. Once, it turned its head toward the observation window, toward me specifically, and I felt something like cold water poured down my spine. It knew I was there. It knew I was listening. Dr. Vaughn explained the protocols. The entity was kept in an electromagnetically shielded environment, temperature held at exactly 68 degrees. Atmosphere, standard Earth, but with slightly elevated argon levels, which seemed to calm it. It didn't eat, or at least we never observed it consuming anything we'd recognize as food. It didn't sleep in any conventional sense, though there were periods of reduced activity that might have been rest. Has it ever tried to escape? I asked. No, it seems patient, like it's waiting for something. Waiting for what? Dr. Vaughn's expression didn't change. That's the question, isn't it? I spent 16 hours a day in that observation room. I brought in linguistic databases, mathematical models, pattern recognition software, primitive by today's standards, but cutting edge for 1974. I tried treating the sounds as tonal language, as mathematical sequences, as music. Nothing worked. Then, on day 19, I stopped trying to decode the sounds and simply listened. And I heard it, not in the sounds themselves, but in the spaces between them. The pauses had structure, duration, rhythm. The entity wasn't speaking in the sounds, it was speaking in the silence between them. I ran back to my analysis station and began mapping the pauses. Binary patterns emerged, then tertiary, then something more complex. A base 12 numerical system encoding something that looked almost like emotional states, conceptual frameworks. I was missing something fundamental. The entity wasn't using language the way humans do. It wasn't encoding specific thoughts into specific sounds. It was creating a framework, a context, and expecting me to fill in the meaning through understanding the structure itself. It was teaching me how to think differently. That night, I barely slept. My wife found me at 3 a.m. with papers spread across our dining room table, drawing diagrams that looked like cross-sections of thought itself. "Robert," she whispered, "what's happening to you?" I couldn't tell her. I couldn't tell anyone. But I was beginning to understand. The breakthrough came during my 6th week on Project Looking Glass. I was alone in the observation room, a violation of protocol, but Dr. Vaughn had begun to trust me. Or perhaps he simply recognized that I was obsessed in a way that made me useful. The entity stood motionless in the center of its chamber as it had for hours. I decided to try something different. Instead of listening to recordings, I would try to produce one of the sounds myself. I'd practiced in my car during the commute, careful never to do it where my wife might hear. The sounds required breathing techniques that felt anatomically wrong, drawing air through pathways that shouldn't exist in human lungs, creating resonances in bone structure rather than vocal cords. I made the sound. The entity's head turned toward me instantly, those black eyes fixed on mine through the observation glass. And for the first time in 27 years of captivity, it moved to the window. It pressed one elongated hand against the glass, 3 fingers, or perhaps 4. The joints made it difficult to count. The hand seemed to phase slightly, as if it wasn't entirely solid or existed in more dimensions than the 3 I could perceive. Then it made a sound back. Not the same sound, a response, a continuation of what I'd started, my heart hammer. I tried another sound, one of the complex sequences I'd memorized. The entity responded again, this time with what I can only describe as elaboration. It was teaching me, correcting me, showing me how the pattern should flow. We continued like this for 47 minutes, back and forth, sound and silence, pattern and response. And then, without warning, something shifted. The sounds stopped being sounds. They became meanings. Not words, not exactly, but concepts that bloomed directly in my consciousness. Understanding without translation, loneliness, time measured differently, waiting for comprehension. So much waiting? I staggered backward from the window. The entity didn't move, but I felt its attention on me like weight, like gravity from a nearby star. "Dr. Chen?" Dr. Vaughn's voice crackled through the intercom. He'd been watching from the security station. "What just happened?" "It's not language," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not communication the way we understand it. It's direct conceptual transfer. It's showing me how it thinks." "Can you translate?" "No, yes, I don't know. It's like trying to translate color to someone who's only ever seen in black and white. The concepts don't map onto human cognitive architecture." Dr. Vaughn was silent for a long moment. Then, "Keep trying." Over the following weeks, the sessions became longer and more complex. I began to understand the entity's perspective, not through words, but through frameworks of thought that felt alien and ancient and utterly logical within their own structure. It perceived time non-linearly. Past and future existed simultaneously in its awareness, like a human seeing all points on a map at once. Events didn't happen in sequence. They existed in relation to each other, in a web of causality that branched and converged and looped back on itself. It didn't have emotions the way humans do, but it had something. States of being that combined what we'd call thought and feeling and sensory experience into unified gestalts. The closest human equivalent might be the moment of understanding when solving a complex mathematical problem. That flash of recognition that's simultaneously intellectual and emotional and almost physical. Communication for its species wasn't about transmitting information. It was about creating shared cognitive spaces where understanding could emerge mutually. And it had been alone in our custody for 27 years. Unable to create that space with anyone. The loneliness I'd felt in our first contact wasn't metaphor. It was literal, existential, a consciousness designed for constant connection, isolated in absolute silence. Other members of the project began to notice changes in me. I lost weight, I stopped eating lunch. I'd stand for hours in the observation room, not speaking, just being present, creating space. Dr. Vaughn pulled me aside one evening. "You're getting too close. You need to maintain objectivity." "There is no objectivity here," I told him. "That's the whole point. Their mode of being requires participation, not observation. If I remain objective, I can't understand. If I understand, I can't remain objective. That's exactly what concerns me." But he didn't pull me from the project. Perhaps because I was the only one making progress. Perhaps because he was curious what would happen if the process continued. My wife grew distant. I came home later each night, my mind still half in that observation room, still feeling the weight of that alien attention. She asked me direct questions I couldn't answer. Where was I really working? What was I really doing? Why did I wake up in the middle of the night, speaking in sounds that weren't words? "I can't tell you," I said. "I'm sorry, I can't." "Then you're choosing it over us," she said quietly. "Over me. Over our marriage." She wasn't wrong, but I couldn't stop. The entity was teaching me something fundamental about consciousness itself, about the assumption that intelligence must look like human intelligence, about the prison of thinking that our way of experiencing reality is the only way, and beneath it all, a growing certainty. The entity wasn't just communicating with me, it was preparing me for something. The breakthrough happened on November 3rd, 1974. I remember the date because it was my daughter's 8th birthday, and I missed her party to stay late at the Pentagon. I'd been working with the entity for 3 months. My marriage was collapsing. My colleagues avoided me in the halls. They could sense something was wrong, even if they didn't know what. I'd lost 23 pounds. I barely slept. When I did, I dreamed in patterns that shouldn't exist in human neurology. That evening I was alone in the observation room. The entity stood in its usual position, motionless. But something was different. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I made the sound we'd been practicing, a complex harmonic pattern that required me to breathe in ways that made my ribs ache, a pattern that meant, roughly, "I am ready to understand more deeply." The entity moved to the window, closer than it had ever come. Those black eyes filled my entire field of vision, and then it touched the glass with both hands. The world inverted. I can't describe it better than that. Reality folded inside out. I wasn't in my body anymore, or I was, but my body was a small thing, a limited thing, a single point of awareness in a vast network of possible awarenesses. I saw the entity's true form, not the biological shell in the chamber, but the consciousness itself. It was vast, ancient. It existed across multiple dimensions of space-time simultaneously, and what I was seeing in the chamber was just a tiny projection, like a shadow cast by a 4-dimensional object onto a 3-dimensional wall. And I understood, with horrible clarity, why it had crashed here. It hadn't crashed. It had chosen to be here. This entity, this being whose name was a topological structure in 11-dimensional space that my brain translated into the concept guardian, had deliberately brought its vessel down in the New Mexico desert in 1947. It had allowed itself to be captured, had endured 27 years of isolation because it was waiting for humanity to develop the capacity to understand, not technology, not science, consciousness itself. We were being tested. Images flooded my mind. Not visual images, conceptual structures that my brain desperately tried to render as sight, sound, memory. I saw Earth from orbit, but not as a physical sphere. I saw it as a living information system, a planet-sized computation running on biological hardware. Billions of human minds, each one a processing node in a network that didn't know it was a network. I saw humanity's future branching into probability clouds. Thousands of possible timelines, most of them ending in extinction within 2 centuries. Nuclear war, environmental collapse, artificial intelligence run amok, genetic catastrophe. The solutions to the Fermi paradox were written in our own potential futures, but some timelines survived, some flourished. In those timelines, humanity made a transition, a cognitive leap that the guardian species had made millions of years ago, a shift from isolated individual consciousness to something larger, more interconnected, without losing individuality. The guardian species didn't have a homeworld anymore. They had transcended the need for one. They existed as pure information encoded in the quantum foam of space-time itself, projecting temporary physical forms when they needed to interact with species still bound to matter. And they were shepherds. Throughout the galaxy, they found species on the edge of this transition. Species intelligent enough to destroy themselves, but not yet wise enough to survive their own intelligence. They watched. They waited. And sometimes, rarely, they intervened. Not to save us. We had to save ourselves. But to show us that salvation was possible. The vision released me. I collapsed to the floor, gasping, tears streaming down my face. My nose was bleeding. I could taste copper. Dr. Vaughn was shouting through the intercom, but I couldn't process the words. Security was coming. I could hear boots in the corridor. The guardian stood at the window watching me, and for the first time, I understood its expression. Compassion. Not pity, not sympathy. True compassion. the recognition of suffering combined with the knowledge that some suffering is necessary for growth. It had shown me the truth because I was ready, because humanity, slowly, painfully, was approaching readiness. But we weren't there yet. They took me to the medical wing, ran tests. CAT scans showed unusual electrical activity in my temporal lobes, patterns that didn't match any known neurological condition. My blood work was normal, my vitals were stable, but something had changed in my brain's fundamental operating system. Dr. Vaughn sat beside my bed at 2 a.m. "What did you see?" he asked quietly. I told him everything. The Guardian's true nature, the test, humanity's branching futures, the cognitive transition we needed to make. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "Do you believe it?" he finally asked. "Or did you have some kind of psychotic break?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe both. Maybe there's no difference. Maybe the only way to understand what the Guardian is showing us requires temporarily breaking our conventional consciousness. Can you do it again?" "I don't know if I'll survive it again." Dr. Vaughn nodded slowly. "The Joint Chiefs want to weaponize this. They think if we can understand the entity's technology, we can build weapons the Soviets can't defend against." "That's exactly the wrong response," I said. "That's the failure mode. The Guardian showed me every species that approaches this transition faces the same choice. Use new knowledge for domination, or use it for transcendence. Choose wrong, and you don't get another chance." "I believe you," Dr. Vaughn said. "But I'm not sure it matters what we believe. This is bigger than both of us now." He was right. Within a week, my access to Project Looking Glass was revoked. I was reassigned to a desk job analyzing agricultural statistics for the Department of Commerce, a calculated humiliation designed to keep me quiet, but the Guardian had already planted the seed, and I spent the next 50 years watching it grow. They couldn't remove what the Guardian had put in my mind. Over the following months, I began to understand the gift I'd been given. It wasn't information exactly. It was a new way of processing information, a different cognitive architecture that existed parallel to my normal human thinking. I could look at complex systems, economic models, social networks, ecological data, and see the underlying patterns, the feedback loops, the tipping points, the strange attractors that pulled systems toward certain outcomes. I saw the world as the Guardian saw it, not as a collection of separate events, but as a unified field of causality. Everything connected, everything influencing everything else. It was beautiful and terrifying. My marriage ended in January 1975. My wife couldn't live with what I'd become, someone who was physically present but mentally somewhere else. Someone who woke up speaking in mathematical concepts that sounded like prophecy. Someone who looked at our daughter and saw probability clouds instead of just a child. I didn't fight the divorce. She was right to leave. I threw myself into work. Not the meaningless desk job they'd given me, but real work. I began writing papers on complex systems theory, game theory, evolutionary dynamics, academic work that I could publish without violating my security clearances. But embedded in those papers were seeds, ideas that came from the Guardian's perspective, concepts that might help humanity navigate toward the positive timelines I'd seen. I couldn't say where the ideas came from. I couldn't point to an alien entity in a Pentagon basement. But I could plant the seeds and hope they'd grow. Some of my papers gained traction in academic circles. Others were ignored. A few were classified by agencies that recognized the implications, even if they didn't know the source. I didn't care about recognition. I cared about the work. Years passed. I was brought back to Project Looking Glass twice more, always briefly, always under heavy supervision. The Guardian never initiated contact again. It simply stood in its chamber, patient and eternal, waiting for humanity to reach the next threshold. Other linguists tried to replicate my breakthrough. All failed. Some had minor successes, fragmentary communications, brief flashes of understanding, but none achieved the full cognitive transfer I'd experienced. Dr. Vaughn told me why during one of my supervised visits. "We think it chose you specifically," he said. Your brain, your psychology, your particular cognitive architecture, something about you made you compatible, like a lock and key. Or like it knew," I said. "If it experiences time non-linearly, it already knew I would be the one. It was waiting for me specifically. That's impossible. Everything about this is impossible. In 1983, I was promoted to a senior analysis position and given limited access to other classified programs. I learned that the Guardian wasn't the only evidence we had. There were multiple crash sites, multiple entities, most dead, some in stasis, and decades of recovered technology that we barely understood. Project Looking Glass was one of 17 special access programs dealing with non-human intelligence. Each was compartmentalized to the point that people working in one program often didn't know the others existed. The government's strategy was clear. Control the information, control the narrative, control the public reaction. Full disclosure would cause panic, social collapse, religious upheaval. Better to keep it secret until we understood it fully, but I'd seen the timelines. I knew that strategy was a trap. The longer we delayed disclosure, the harder the eventual revelation would be. Trust in institutions was eroding. Conspiracy theories were proliferating. The truth would eventually come out. It always does. And if it came out through leaks and chaos rather than managed disclosure, The damage would be catastrophic. I tried to argue this in classified briefings. I wrote memos that went to the National Security Council. I begged them to consider a gradual disclosure strategy. I was ignored. The machine of secrecy had momentum. Careers were built on maintaining it. Budgets depended on it. Power flowed from it. No one wanted to be the person who broke the system. By the late 1990s, I had risen to director level. I supervised teams analyzing everything from recovered propulsion systems to linguistic patterns in alien data streams. I had access to information that would shatter most people's understanding of reality, and I couldn't tell anyone. My daughter, grown now with children of her own, asked me once what I really did for all those years. I helped prepare for a future most people can't imagine, I told her. She thought I was being metaphorical. The moral weight became crushing. I watched 9/11 happen and knew with the certainty the Guardian had given me, that humanity's response would push us toward one of the darker timelines. The security state metastasizing, civil liberties eroding, the US versus them mentality that made the cognitive transition impossible. I watched climate change accelerate and knew we had the technology to address it. Recovered technology that could revolutionize energy production, but we couldn't release it without revealing its source. I watched artificial intelligence develop and knew it was one of the great filters. The Guardian had shown me species that created AI and died, species that created AI and transcended. The difference was subtle but absolute, and I couldn't say anything. Every briefing, every memo, every attempt to nudge policy toward the positive timelines, it all felt futile, like trying to steer an avalanche with my bare hands. In 2015, I was diagnosed with cancer for the first time. They caught it early. Treatment worked. I went into remission. But I started thinking about legacy, about what would happen to all this knowledge when I died. The Guardian was still in custody, still patient, still waiting. Humanity was still failing the test. And I was running out of time to make a difference. The cancer came back in 2023. Stage 4 this time. Pancreatic. The doctors used words like aggressive and limited options and palliative care. I had perhaps a year, maybe less. That's when I made my decision. I requested one final visit to Project Looking Glass. By then, I was 76 years old, officially retired, but still holding emergency clearances for consultation purposes. The program had evolved. New directors, new protocols, new technologies for studying the Guardian, but the entity itself was unchanged, still standing in its chamber, still waiting. They let me into the observation room alone, a final courtesy to an old man who'd given 50 years to the secret. I stood at the window. The Guardian turned its head toward me, those black eyes reflecting nothing and everything. I made the sound, the one we'd shared almost 50 years ago. And the Guardian responded. This time, the cognitive transfer was gentler, or perhaps I was better prepared. The information flowed into my consciousness like water finding its level. The Guardian showed me what it had been waiting for. Not technological advancement, not political unification, not even peace. Readiness to accept our place in the cosmos. The universe, the Guardian showed me, was full of intelligent life. Thousands of species at various stages of development. But only a few made the transition from isolated planetary consciousness to something greater. The barrier wasn't technology, it was psychology. Species had to reach a point where they could accept 3 truths simultaneously. First, you're not alone. You never were. The cosmos is full of intelligence far older and stranger than you can imagine. Second, you're not special. Your biology, your history, your religions, your philosophies, they're not unique. They're predictable stages in the evolution of consciousness. Third, despite not being special, you matter. Your particular expression of consciousness, your unique perspective, your specific cultural evolution, it has value to the larger community of minds. Most species couldn't hold all 3 truths at once. They either retreated into denial, you are alone, you are special, nothing challenges your worldview, or they collapsed into nihilism, you're not special, therefore nothing matters. The ones that made it through, the ones that achieved the transition, were the ones that could hold the paradox. Yes, we're ordinary. Yes, we matter. Both things true simultaneously. The Guardian showed me more. It showed me its own species' history. Millions of years ago, they'd faced the same test. They'd nearly failed. 97% of their population chose extinction rather than accept their cosmic ordinariness. But the 3% who survived and adapted became something new. They shed their attachment to physical form. They learned to encode consciousness in the quantum structure of space-time itself. They became the shepherds, guiding other species through the same transition they'd barely survived. Not out of altruism, out of necessity. The universe, the Guardian showed me, was evolving towards something. A cosmic scale consciousness that would emerge when enough species made the transition, when enough isolated minds joined the network. But it couldn't be forced. Each species had to choose freely, and most chose extinction instead. Humanity was at the threshold now. We had the technology to destroy ourselves or transcend ourselves. The window was narrow, perhaps 50 years, perhaps less. The Guardian's presence on Earth was the final signal, the final test. If we could accept the Guardian's existence without panic, without trying to weaponize it, without collapsing into existential despair, then we were ready. If we couldn't, the timeline branches showed me what came next, and most of them were dark. The vision released me gently this time. I sat down on the floor of the observation room, tears streaming down my face, not from fear, from understanding. The Guardian hadn't been imprisoned for 50 years. It had been waiting, patient beyond human comprehension, waiting for even one human to fully understand the message. And now I understood. The test wasn't for humanity as a whole. Not yet. The test was for individuals, for the ones who could hold the paradox, for the ones who could look at the Guardian and see not a threat, not a god, not a resource to exploit, but a teacher, a mirror showing us what we could become. I left Project Looking Glass that day knowing I would never return. My cancer was progressing. I had months, not years, but I finally understood my purpose. The Guardian couldn't speak to humanity directly. The cognitive transfer required preparation, compatibility, readiness. Most humans would experience it as madness or death, but I could speak. I could translate. I could plant the seeds of understanding in language humans could process, not the full truth that would shatter unprepared minds, but fragments, concepts, stories that carried the deeper patterns hidden in their structure. I'd been doing it for 50 years without fully understanding why. Now I knew. I was a bridge, one of many the Guardian had cultivated across decades. Humans who'd touched the bigger truth and could metabolize it, integrate it, translate it into forms other humans could absorb. We were the Guardian's ambassadors to our own species. I spent the next 3 months writing, not classified reports, not academic papers, but stories, essays, accounts that walked the line between truth and fiction, between testimony and parable. I posted them online anonymously. I sent them to journalists, researchers, anyone who might listen. I violated every security protocol I'd ever sworn to uphold, because I finally understood. The rules designed to protect us were the same rules preventing us from passing the test. Secrecy was the failure mode. The Guardian's message was clear. Transparency, vulnerability, honesty about our cosmic situation, that was the path through. That was how we'd survive. And if revealing that truth meant the government prosecuted me, imprisoned me, discredited me, so be it. I was dying anyway. I'd spend my final months doing what the Guardian had waited 50 years for me to do. Tell the truth. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 72 hours of posting my first account online, my home was raided by federal agents, unmarked vehicles, men in dark suits with badges from agencies that didn't officially exist. They confiscated my computers, my files, my notes. They sat me down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd done decades of classified work, and explained very carefully that I'd violated the Espionage Act, multiple national security directives, and agreements that carried criminal penalties up to life imprisonment. I listened politely. Then I asked, "Are you going to arrest a dying man for telling the truth?" The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with the tired eyes of someone who'd spent too long carrying secrets, looked at me for a long moment. "Dr. Chen, you don't understand what you've done. The disclosure protocols exist for a reason. Uncontrolled information release could cause mass panic, social collapse." "I've heard that argument for 50 years, I interrupted, "and I've watched it become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The longer we wait, the worse it gets. The Guardian showed me the timelines. Controlled secrecy leads to controlled extinction." She didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or doubt. They left without arresting me, but the surveillance was constant after that. Black SUVs parked across the street, my phone tapped, my internet monitored. They were waiting to see what I'd do next. My posts had gone viral. Not in the mainstream. Most people dismissed them as creative fiction or the ravings of a senile old man. But in certain communities, researchers, truth seekers, people who'd had their own inexplicable experiences, they resonated. I received thousands of messages, some thanking me, some calling me a liar, some sharing their own encounters with things they couldn't explain, and some, a small number, but significant, from other people like me, other bridges, other individuals who'd been part of classified programs, who'd touched the larger truth, who were also dying, and had also decided that truth mattered more than security clearances. We found each other in the chaos, coordinated our disclosures. Not a conspiracy, a convergence. People independently reaching the same conclusion. Time was running out, and humanity needed to know. The government's response was predictable, a coordinated disinformation campaign. Op-eds in major newspapers explaining how classified programs were being misrepresented by confused retirees with medical conditions affecting their cognition. Experts explaining recovered materials in conventional terms. Experimental aircraft, Cold War technology, nothing extraterrestrial. They released just enough real classified information to muddy the waters. Acknowledged secret programs studying UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. They'd stopped saying UFOs decades ago. Admitted to recovered materials of unknown origin, but always with caveats, always with conventional explanations, hovering just out of reach. The strategy was sophisticated. Don't deny everything. Acknowledge just enough to seem transparent while revealing nothing that mattered. Control the narrative by appearing to lose control of it. I watched it happen in real time, and I understood. They were doing exactly what the Guardian had shown me would fail. They were trying to manage something that couldn't be managed, trying to control a truth that would eventually overwhelm any container built around it. Then the congressional hearings began. Whistleblowers, some I knew, some I didn't, testified under oath about non-human intelligence, recovered craft, reverse engineering programs. The testimonies were careful, limited by classification, but undeniable. The media picked it up. Not front page news, not yet, but no longer dismissible as fringe conspiracy. Serious journalists asking serious questions. Former officials acknowledging programs they'd once denied existed. The Overton window was shifting. I watched from my hospice bed, between rounds of pain medication, as humanity took its first stumbling steps toward the truth. It wasn't the controlled disclosure the government had feared. It wasn't the immediate revelation I'd hoped for. It was messy, chaotic, half-truths mixing with whole truths, signal and noise impossible to separate. It was perfect, because this was how humans actually process revolutionary information. Not through careful official announcements, but through chaotic collective sense-making, arguments and debates, and people slowly, painfully adjusting their worldviews to accommodate new possibilities. The Guardian had known, had waited for exactly this, for the moment when the truth would emerge organically, messily, in a way that allowed humanity to integrate it without shattering. My daughter visited me in hospice. She'd avoided me for months after the disclosures started, embarrassed by her father's very public apparent breakdown. But she came, sat beside my bed, held my hand. "Dad," she said quietly, "was it real? Any of it?" I looked at her, my daughter now in her 50s, with grandchildren of her own. I'd missed so much of her life for the work, for the secret. "Yes," I told her. Every word. She cried. Not from disbelief, from belief, from the sudden reorientation of everything she thought she knew about her father, about the world, about reality itself. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked. "Because I couldn't, and because you weren't ready." "Nobody was ready?" "We're barely ready now. What happens next?" I smiled. The pain medication made everything soft-edged, dreamlike. Humanity passes the test, or it doesn't, but either way, the truth is out now. It can't be put back in the box. She squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, Dad, even if I don't fully understand." "Understanding takes time," I said. "The Guardian waited 50 years for me. Give yourself more than a day." The government never prosecuted me. My health deteriorated too rapidly, and prosecuting a dying man for telling the truth would have made him a martyr. Instead, they let me fade. Let the story become one more piece of noise in an increasingly noisy information landscape. But the seed was planted, growing, spreading through human consciousness like the Guardian had always known it would. Slowly, messily, but inevitably. 3 weeks before I died, I had one final visitor, Dr. Vaughn, now in his 90s, confined to a wheelchair, but still sharp, still carrying the weight of 50 years of secrets. The hospice nurses left us alone. He wheeled himself close to my bed. We sat in silence for a long time, two old men who'd spent their lives in the same maze. "They're going to declassify some of it," he said finally. "Not everything, not the Guardian, but enough. UAPs, recovered materials, government programs, a managed disclosure over the next decade." "Too slow," I whispered. My voice was weak now. The cancer had spread to my lungs. "Maybe, but it's happening. Because of what you did, what we all did. Will it be enough?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know. I saw what you saw, after you. They brought me into the observation room, let the Guardian transfer consciousness to me too. Wanted independent confirmation that you weren't just insane. This surprised me. In 50 years, he'd never mentioned it." "What did you see?" I asked. "The same thing you did. The timelines, the test, the choice." He looked out the window at the hospital parking lot, at the ordinary world that had no idea what was coming. "I spent 50 years trying to prepare us for that choice. Behind the scenes, in classified briefings, planting seeds in policy. You went public, different strategies, same goal. Did we succeed? Ask me in 50 years. Well, we both smiled at that. Neither of us would be here in 50 years. "The Guardian is dying," Dr. Vaughn said suddenly. I felt something lurch in my chest. "What?" "Its biological form, the projection it uses to interact with our dimension. It's been deteriorating for the last decade. We think the effort of maintaining physical presence for over 70 years has exhausted it." "You mean it's choosing to die?" "Yes. The mission is complete. It planted the seed. Now it's letting go." Tears rolled down my cheeks. For an entity I'd spoken with for mere minutes, spread across 50 years. For a consciousness that had endured decades of isolation to give humanity a chance. "Have you been back to see it?" I asked. "Every year. It doesn't communicate anymore. Just stands there, fading. But I feel like it's satisfied. Like it knows the work is done." We sat together as the afternoon light faded. Two old men who'd dedicated their lives to a truth most people still couldn't accept. "I'm afraid," I admitted. "Not of dying, of failing, of humanity choosing extinction." "We don't get to know how it turns out," Dr. Vaughn said. "That's the hardest part. We plant the seeds, but we don't live to see the harvest. The Guardian sees it, all the timelines simultaneously. And it chose to be here anyway, to endure captivity, Isolation, the slow death of its projected form, that has to mean something. That has to mean it believed we had a chance. I thought about that. An entity that could see all possible futures chose to sacrifice itself for ours. Not because our success was guaranteed, but because it was possible. That was faith, real faith. Not the certainty of knowing, but the commitment to possibility. What should I have done differently? I asked. Dr. Vaughn shook his head. Nothing. You did what you could. I did what I could. Thousands of others did what they could. The Guardian did what it could. Now it's up to the species as a whole. That's terrifying. Yes, but also appropriate. This can't be decided by a few people in classified rooms. It has to be a collective choice. Messy, chaotic, imperfect. That's what democracy looks like when confronted with cosmic truth. He left as the sun set. I never saw him again. He died 2 weeks later, heart attack in his sleep. A good death for a man who'd carried such heavy truths. I lay in my hospice bed, watching the evening light fade to darkness. The pain medication kept most of the discomfort away, but there was a deeper ache it couldn't touch. The ache of unfinished work, of questions unanswered. Would humanity pass the test? Would we make the transition? Or would we join the countless other species that chose extinction over evolution? I'd spent 50 years trying to tip the scales, speaking when I could, staying silent when I had to, planting seeds in academic papers, classified briefings, and finally, at the end, public testimony. But I'd never know if it was enough. That night, I had a dream. Or perhaps it wasn't a dream. The boundary between states of consciousness had become porous as death approached. I was in the observation room again, young, healthy, standing at the window. The Guardian was there, but different. Not the dying projection Dr. Vaughn had described. Vibrant, present, real in a way it had never been before. It pressed its hand to the glass. I pressed mine to match it. And I understood. This wasn't memory. This wasn't dying hallucination. This was the Guardian reaching across time, using its nonlinear perception to speak to me one final time. You did well. Not words, concept, meaning transmitted directly. The outcome is still uncertain. It always was. But you increased the probability. You and others like you. Enough that I can return now. Return where? Home. To the network. To join the others who've completed their shepherding. What about humanity? They'll choose. They always do. Some will understand. Some will fight. Some will try to weaponize. Some will despair. But enough will choose growth. Enough to keep the possibility alive. You can't know that. No. But I believe it. Belief is the only rational response to uncertainty. The vision faded. I woke in my hospice bed, dawnlight filtering through the window. I knew with strange certainty that the Guardian had died during the night, its physical form finally releasing, its consciousness returning to whatever larger network sustained its species. The test was over, not in the sense of completion, but in the sense of transition. The training wheels were coming off. Humanity would have to navigate the rest on its own. We had the tools, the knowledge, the choice. Now we just had to make it. I died on December 17th, 2024, 77 years old, surrounded by my daughter and grandchildren who still didn't fully understand what I'd dedicated my life to. But this account, written in my final weeks, compiled from recordings and notes, survives me. I'm not the only one. Dozens of others from the programs have come forward, some before me, some after, each adding pieces to a puzzle that humanity is slowly, painfully learning to assemble. The government continues its gradual disclosure. Congressional hearings, declassified documents, carefully managed releases of information that confirm what people like me have been saying. We're not alone. We've never been alone. But that's not the real revelation. The real revelation, the one the Guardian waited 50 years for me to understand and share, is this. We're being invited to join something larger than ourselves. Not through conquest, not through submission, but through conscious evolution, through choosing to become the kind of species that can coexist with others, that can hold the paradox of being simultaneously ordinary and valuable, that can accept our place in a cosmos full of intelligence without collapsing into existential despair or defensive aggression. The timelines I saw, those branching paths of probability, are still unfolding. Every day, humanity makes thousands of small choices that push us toward one future or another. Some signs are encouraging. Young people seem more ready to accept cosmic plurality than their parents were. The internet, chaotic and problematic as it is, has prepared minds for the idea that reality is stranger and more interconnected than we were taught. Other signs are darker. Tribalism intensifying, conspiracy replacing critical thinking, the impulse to weaponize everything to see all contact as potential threat. We're balanced on a knife's edge, just like the Guardian showed me. But here's what I learned in 50 years of living with this knowledge. Fear is normal. Denial is normal. Even resistance is normal. We're asking our species to make a transition that violates every instinct evolution gave us, to accept that we're not the center of the universe, to acknowledge that beings far older and stranger exist, to recognize that our religions, our philosophies, our sense of unique purpose, they're not wrong exactly, but they're incomplete. That's terrifying. Of course people resist. But resistance isn't failure. Resistance is part of the process. The species that make the transition aren't the ones that accept cosmic truth immediately. They're the ones that struggle with it, wrestle with it, gradually integrated over generations. We don't need everyone to understand immediately. We just need enough people to hold the possibility, enough minds willing to engage with the uncertainty. The rest will follow, slowly, across decades, but it will follow. My final message to whoever reads this, whenever you read it, is simple. You're living through the most important transition in human history. Not because aliens exist, we've always suspected that, but because for the first time, we're being forced to actually confront what that means, to integrate it, to change ourselves in response. Every choice you make matters, not in a cosmic destiny of the species sense that's too heavy, but in small daily ways. Do you respond to new information with curiosity or fear? Do you see difference as threat or as possibility? Can you hold uncertainty without collapsing into either blind faith or cynical denial? Can you accept that you don't know everything while still engaging meaningfully with what you do know? These aren't abstract questions. They're the test. The same test every species faces. The same test we're facing now. The Guardian is gone. Its mission complete. It endured 70 years of isolation to give us this chance. Thousands of humans, analysts, scientists, military personnel, politicians, have dedicated their lives to preparing for this moment. Some openly, most in secret. Now it's your turn. Not to believe everything, not to accept blindly, but to engage honestly, to question deeply, to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously, to become the kind of consciousness that can survive contact with others. In my final days, I asked myself, was it worth it? 50 years of secrecy, a failed marriage, alienation from my daughter, missing her childhood, her wedding, the births of my grandchildren, living with knowledge I couldn't share, watching humanity stumble toward truths I could see but couldn't speak. Was it worth it? I don't know, but I know this. I was part of something larger than myself. I helped plant seeds that might help humanity navigate the most dangerous transition it will ever face, and that has to be enough. The Guardian showed me that consciousness itself is evolving, not just on Earth, but throughout the cosmos. Individual minds slowly, painfully, learning to connect without losing themselves. Species learning to coexist without erasing difference. It's a process measured in millions of years. We're just one small part of it, but every part matters. Every species that makes the transition adds to the network. Every consciousness that learns to hold the paradox makes the next one easier. We're not alone. We've never been alone. And if we can accept that, truly accept it with all its implications, we might just survive what comes next. There are still places where the impossible exists in silence, where truths too large for institutions wait patiently for minds ready to receive them. The Guardian came from such a place, waited in such a silence, and gave everything to show us the way through. The least we can do is try. Final words, recorded December 16th, 2024, 11:47 p.m. Some secrets aren't meant to be kept forever. Some truths are meant to be inherited, not hoarded. To whoever finds this, the knowledge is yours now, not to weaponize, not to exploit, but to metabolize, to integrate, to share carefully with others who are ready. The Guardian believed we could make it, believed it enough to die for that belief. Don't prove it wrong. The future, all possible futures, are waiting for you to choose.